I think we hit it off more as friends to begin with, but then we got put on projects together and we were like, we are vibing. There's something special going on here. You know, when you look at someone
You guys.
deeply in their eyes, no, I'm joking. When you, this is really cringe, isn't it?
No, I feel like I wish everyone could be in the studio because the energy is very magic right now. Like, you guys genuinely love each other, right?
Yes. Oh my God, co-founder relationships are a marriage, period.
I'm Hattie Willis, your host, and each episode I talk to an entrepreneur, investor, or startup expert to unpack their hardest moments, biggest wins, and hard-earned advice so we can shortcut our learnings as founders together. Today, I'm extra excited to be bringing you this episode because it is with two incredible friends of mine. So it brings me great delight to say today I'm joined by the founders of the Future Kind Collective, Alicia Grimes and Natalie Pierce. Having initially met when Natalie was interviewing Alicia for a job, the two found themselves working in the same company on strategy and service design projects focused on culture change. What started as a working relationship, though, soon blossomed into a deep friendship, and the two bonded on a shared feeling that something wasn't quite right about traditional culture consulting and a change was needed. Alicia and Natalie thought that a more holistic approach was called for, with a focus on a genuine care for the people behind the business, prioritising people over profit, with as much focus on employees as customers. These ideas and design principles paved the way for the Future Kind Collective to be born, where a team was built that focuses on turning around the culture of companies to create a better environment for all involved, or starting right and helping startups create great cultures from day one. In this episode, we discuss how Alicia and Natalie met and the birth of Future Kind Collective, imposter syndrome, the definition of culture, how founders can use values to make decisions about what they do and don't do, and the importance of saying no as founders. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed recording it both times.
Welcome to the show. Second time trying to film this episode. So if you hear us referencing a previous episode, it's because we recorded the best episode ever and then accidentally some errors happened. But this episode is going to be even better.
Yes.
We are going to dive in firstly to your story. So how did you both start Future Kind Collective? What were you doing beforehand? I'm going to come to Nat first.
Well, both of us come from a design background. So for me, it was a bit of strategy and innovation and kind of digital transformation. For you, it was more like service design and, well, you were also an artist as well.
Yeah.
We'll go way back to there. And I was working in a design agency doing digital design projects for various clients. And when I joined that agency, I was employee number 3. So it was very much like everyone's doing everything. We're starting it up. We're helping grow it. And I gravitated towards all of the people and culture elements. I was like, we need to design an onboarding experience and let's just do it in the same way that we would do any client project. And so that ended up carving out a role for me, which was head of culture. So when we needed a leadership team, I was like, hey, we need a head of culture. And they were like, oh, right, okay. And I was like, and she's here. It's me. Like, spoiler alert. Yeah. And so that was kind of my journey prior to meeting you.
Best moment of your life.
Best moment of my life, yeah. So you were in New Zealand and I came on to interview and it was the most chaotic interview ever, wasn't it? Like none of the tech worked. You were fine. She was totally fine. Apart from the fact that it was
chaotic
like
energy. It was 10
like
p.m.
10 p.m.
Friday night.
And wait, who's interviewing who and for what?
I was interviewing Alicia, who wanted to come back to so you were living in New Zealand. She wanted to come to the UK, back to the UK. And so I was interviewing her as a service designer role. And we kind of hit it off in that interview. I mean, it wasn't that interview where she was like, hey, do you want to start a business?
Forget this, scrap this interview.
And then obviously you came to the UK and I think we hit it off more as friends to begin with, but then we got put on projects together and we were like, we are vibing. There's something special going on here. You know, when you look at someone
You guys.
deeply in their eyes, no, I'm joking. When you,
This is really cringe, isn't it?
No, I feel like I
it's
wish
a love
everyone
story.
I wish everyone could be in the studio because the energy is very magic right now. Like, you guys genuinely love each other, right?
Yes. Oh my God.
Beautiful.
Co-founder relationships are a marriage, period.
Yeah. So that was the beautiful moment when we met, was that interview. And like you say, it progressed from there. And I think Nat alluded to it. it's not that often. We work with amazing people, right? But when you have that moment when you're working together and collaborating, and the speed at which you're doing it, it was almost like the unspoken words.
Yeah, that's
like,
what I meant. When you look at each other and you're like, yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you're thinking.
And it was just rapidly through that, and then sort of working together, drinking wine together, where the best ideas come from. I said to you,
You proposed.
I proposed, would you like to start a business together?
Well, actually, what happened, I think what actually happened was, that is basically what happened, but
The true story.
the framing was slightly different. So we were out, I was debriefing around a life-changing experience I had in Bali, so cliche.
I love it.
I was like, I found myself, all of that stuff. And then you were like, oh, well, I'd really like to start a business one day. And I've always wanted to start it with someone else, which was the massive hint. And I was like, oh, that's so good for you, babe. I'd love that for you. And she was like, no. Like, I want to start a business with you. And I was like, oh my God. I didn't see that as a pathway prior to that.
And I want to drill in on that, because you were talking about joining this really early stage startup. And I actually think it's something, when we come back to hiring for startups, that founders don't play up enough. Actually, if you join a startup, you just get this insane experience that then helps you start your own company. But it's interesting to hear that you were at this startup, love the energy you came in with of like, hey guys, I'm your next head of culture. I think we all need more of that in our lives. But was entrepreneurship something you thought you wanted ever, both of you, before this? Or you said it was something you kind of had in the back of your mind. So maybe starting with that, was it something you wanted? And what was, if not, because I think I know the answer, what needed to be reframed when Alicia asked you?
Well, I think that you had more classic startup experience. And what I mean by that is, whilst the agency that I was at was very much a startup in the way in which they operated, they were owned by a bigger tech consultancy. So like, we never had to worry about our salaries.
Yeah.
You know, like, we didn't have work in for a long time, but we were still getting paid and having a great time. So there was less of that startup risk that I think maybe prepares you more for going down the entrepreneurship journey. I think as well, I definitely had a lot of imposter syndrome throughout my career, like a lot of comparison, not thinking that I'm good enough. And so I didn't really know what my niche was, because I was good at lots of things, but not brilliant, like any specific ones. For me, in my head, I was like, you need all of the skills in order to run a business, not I'm really good at this thing and we can hire other people, we can learn the other parts. But where I was in that part of my career where Alicia asked about starting a business, I had got to a point where I knew that I wanted to move on and do something different. Like, I didn't want to stay where I was. But when I looked inside the company, there was no role that I was like, I want that person's role. Or like, I'm inspired by this role over here outside. I'd look at jobs and I was like, I don't want any of these roles. And so now I know that that was a clue that I probably shouldn't be working for someone else. I should be working for myself. But I hadn't put two and two together until you were like, here it is.
Yeah.
Do this.
And I think, you said you didn't find those things you were brilliant at. The reason I wanted Nat as my co-founder is because she is brilliant at many things. And I think that is the essence that you see in each other and you need to see as co-founders, right? And I think that sometimes you need someone to have those conversations with and make you realize that. And that was deluded me, who was like, yeah, I want to run a business. Come along on the ride. And yeah, we did it together.
Well, I think because you'd worked at a more traditional startup, I think you were maybe more primed to go and do it. Whereas, or like, you had the risk in a more transparent way, whereas I was just like, it was more of an unknown.
And I think it's really interesting because we interviewed Millie Tomati from Generalist World, and I think it's a founder trait, right? This, I like to wear many hats. And actually, I don't want to pin myself to one role. My old boss called me a goldfish, and that was a compliment, right? I hate doing one thing for too long.
Yeah.
So I want to drill in as well to that imposter syndrome piece, because hearing you talk about, I put myself forward, I'm your next head of culture. It's right. I'm like, she doesn't have imposter syndrome. She's got it all together. She has all the confidence we all need. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. To be honest, the reason I did that is because I had amazing people around me that was like, you're already doing this role. If anything, you should be running like the agency. And I was like, I don't need that right now. But I had amazing people that were vouching for me, that were saying, no, you should do this. So the people that were telling me to go for these roles, they were a lot more experienced than me on paper. And I would have expected them to want to put themselves forward for these roles. But they were like, no, you're younger and less experienced than me. I want to put you forward and I want you to be our manager. I'd never experienced that before, because when I was in corporate environments beforehand, it was very, very hierarchical. And I had the experience of being like, you're too young to go to this next manager level, or you're too young to, progress. And so I think that kind of feeds into your imposter syndrome a bit, because you're like, oh, maybe there are loads of things that I don't know. But also I'd gone from working in a slow, more moving organization. So I was in banking prior to the agency, where innovation and, it was just very slow moving. And then I'd gone to an agency where everything is fast moving. And anyone that's worked in agency or consultancy knows that there is always times when you're put in front of a client as an expert and you're like, I do not have a clue what this role is, let alone what I'm meant to be doing here. So I think whilst I'm grateful for those experiences, because I think it does help you in business, because you're like, I can always learn, I can always figure it out. It broke my confidence for quite some time. But then, as I say, because there was lots of people that were vouching for me and saw something in me, I was like, yeah, fuck it. I'm gonna put myself forward for that. And when the thing is with me, when you tap into that part of my brain, I go hell for leather. I'm like, I don't think I've said that saying right, have I?
It sounds right.
Yeah,
I'll go with that.
So I'll be like, yeah, I'm either loads of self-doubt or I'm so confident that it's actually borderline aggressive. Would you agree? It's one or the other.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I was like, I love the borderline aggressive part.
That's always my
But I think that's great, right? It's like the all or nothing thing. And I think it's that tenacity that you need as a founder, because you have to bring that energy to it.
Yeah.
And I think also that imposter syndrome, we all experience that in some way, shape or form. I think as a founder, you have to remind yourself that you're like, we're paving this out for ourselves 100%. In a space that potentially no one's done it before or very differently. Yeah. So that's when it can really creep in. But equally, what we should be framing it is like, I'm crafting this myself and I'm showing up as my true self. And I think that's the one thing of running your own business and being a founder. The only expectations are from yourself. And so it's like being kind to yourself and what that looks like, and why a co-founder relationship is so important. Because if either of us is having one of those days, most of the time the other person isn't, and is like, you got this, we're all good. When both of us have it, it's just like, we'll just skip today.
But we have a team now, so that's good.
Exactly.
And I want to come back to how you help, because I think one of the things that is hard about startups is that you're often hiring people who are less experienced because you have less budget. And so how do you I want to come back to how you actively curate your leadership style so you don't, to your point, give people opportunities that, while they might seem like amazing opportunities, without extra care and support, might reinforce. Yeah. I've been in these rooms and I've really been having to pretend. And I think, to your point, I often say to founders, in fact, I said it on a coaching call this morning, imposter syndrome is inevitable growing something because no one's done it before. And actually, I think you've kind of got to lean into it as almost like stretch marks, right? Like you're growing so fast, you're going to have these beautiful marks on your body that lots of people will tell you for years and years and years you shouldn't have. But actually, most people who've grown that fast will have them.
Yeah.
And I think it's super important as well, going back to the point of confidence. I think it's really easy to think that the people we see modeling confidence don't have any of the imposter syndrome. Yeah. And most people I know do, and Lauren Curry talks about this beautifully in her episode, and you introduced me to Lauren, actually, having been on a bond. But this idea of confidence ebbs and flows. Yeah. And it's not going to be a destination that you arrive at and you're like, ta-da, I've reached self-actualization. I wish. I still have it. I messaged my co-founder, Tim, the other week. He asked me to do something and I was like, oh, yeah, imposter syndrome really came in there. But actually what becomes powerful, I think, is that you start to be able to step back and observe, like, that's interesting, that's triggered imposter syndrome. Like, let's work through that together. So how do leaders who want to grow exceptional talent really quickly in their companies, and I'm thinking startup scale-ups where everything's moving fast, feel quite time poor, how do you help team members to grow at a pace that's, I guess, healthy and sustainable for their growth without embedding some of these feelings of always being in a room and slightly having to put a front on it?
I think the key part to us, and is what we always talk about, is just making sure your team are really aligned on what is your vision and the direction you're heading in. And that's really important as founders as well, because you need to be able to relinquish some of that control. And I think one of the things we were most worried about bringing on our own team was like, okay, well, how good are we going to be at relinquishing that control? And it's about going, we're going to empower you because you know what we want to deliver, because there's the vision here, and we're going to trust you. And that can be hard, but I think it's about saying, this is our purpose and our vision of like the direction we're heading in. These are our values. This is how we show up and behave, and what we do and what we don't do as well, and giving them those tools. But also, I think it has to be a mindset of constantly being in that MVP phase as well, and going, we're going to try. There's a high likelihood we're going to fail, and we're going to learn, and we're going to try again. And we've got to keep doing that, because that's the only way you can keep up with the pace. And it's hard, don't get me wrong. We can be reviewing every content post that goes out or whatever it is, like being really in the detail. And you have to go, whoa, hang on a minute. I've entrusted someone to do this. I need to bring it up a level. And if it goes out and it's not the greatest post, or there's a spelling mistake, that's not where we can spend our time and energy, because we have to have that strategic view. We have to be empowering the team to move forward. But I think it is putting those principles in place to make sure that they know how you show up, how you behave, and the direction you're heading in, and keep communicating it as well. And also celebrating those failures, because that's the only way that you learn, and also help to avoid or prevent, because you can't always avoid it, but prevent some of that imposter syndrome as well. Because there's a danger you make it worse if you keep going back to someone and going, that's not right, or do it this way, because they have to find their way to do it that helps deliver on your vision.
Yeah. I would also say creating an environment where it's okay to ask for help, and acknowledging that, yes, it's going to be annoying in the early stages, but if you allow that space for people to continually ask questions, ask for help, get clarity, then those questions are going to become less and less. And you have less kind of risk of having to undo or duplicate work or redo things later down the line. And I think that, I know that our team, they have said before, oh, we don't want to ask too many questions, or like, oh, we don't want to overstep the mark. Every time they've perceived themselves as overstepping the mark, what they've done is absolutely brilliant. And we're like, holy shit, like I wouldn't have thought of that, or that's a really good challenge. So what we're trying to do, and it is definitely a journey, is show that it is okay to ask for help, role model us asking for help.
That vulnerability.
Being vulnerable, being like, I don't know this, like getting opinions from everyone, not just, we have obviously a Slack channel that's just the two of us. Rather than asking questions there, ask it in the bigger channel so that everyone sees and they can comment if they want to. I think that's really important, because there are some things that you'll be like, oh, I've explained this, but I've now learned that it was perceived in a different way. But if someone's able to ask and clarify and say, is this what you meant, without feeling guilty, or, like some people save it up. You're like, oh, I'm not going to ask them about this thing because I want to ask them about this thing. But then the longer you leave some of those areas that they did want to ask questions on, the more risk that they're going off in a different direction. It's like, nip it in the bud as early as possible. And that's all around psychological safety and vulnerability, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think the one question that we asked ourselves, and I would want any leader or leadership team to ask themselves as they're rapidly hiring, is what type of leaders and leadership team do we want to be? And to really set that up as you go to hire, or even before that, because as you're forming, you need to make sure that you can then set that direction and how you're going to show up. And even if you are a small team like we are, having that conversation of like, how are we going to show up as leaders, and what does that look like? Because ultimately we're setting the tone for that, and we need to get that right before we add anyone else into this.
And I think that brings me on to, I often describe Future Kind Collective, and I'm so sorry if I'm about to offend anyone else. I'm not going to offend you guys, but as one of the culture consultancies that actually moves the needle. You're not just talking culture. It's not just fuzzy words that everyone kind of nods along to because it sounds good, but you're like, I have no idea what that means in practice. So let's get into some of the kind of practical side. You talked about defining your own leadership style at the beginning. What are some of the things that founders should be doing when they're making those first hires that they think about personal leadership and also about cultural values? And I love the way you guys talk about cultural values and in the kind of day-to-day. So if we can talk a little bit about that.
I think to your first question and that sort of what that looks like in actually culture and really shifting the dial and what that looks like and what leaders need to think about is we like to actually think about the company operating system that sits underneath your culture, that is effectively your culture and what that's made up of. So I think it is your purpose and vision, so the direction that you're heading in and your North Star. It's your values, so how you show up and behave, and we'll talk to how that's brought to life. But then you also have to be thinking about what your strategy and metrics, like how do you do things, how do you measure it, and how do you do it better than anyone else? And then what is your leadership? Like how are you coaching, developing, mentoring? No matter how big your team is, start thinking about that early on. And then underneath that is your behaviors, which speaks to your values, how you show up every day, your rituals, how you get together, you communicate, you collaborate, your processes and systems. All of that is everything from decision-making to prioritization. And that is the stuff that is fundamental to getting right, because that is your teamwork. That structure is your teamwork. And then it's how you bring that to life in your values and how you show up and behave every day.
Can I ask you, actually, I should have asked this earlier, but in what you're about to say, can you also define culture? Because you guys have got a brilliant definition and I think it gets bandied around as a term a lot.
Yeah.
And we don't often stop and go, well, what the hell is culture?
Yeah, absolutely. So we describe culture as a social contract between a group of people that defines how they're going to be successful towards their shared goal. So that's relevant for a company, it's relevant for a community, it's relevant for your neighborhood watch. Do you know what I mean? It's not just in a work sense. It's when you bring people together that say, we believe in this and we have a shared goal, your culture is how you are going to deliver that or reach that successfully. And so I think that part of the issue around culture is that it's often seen as something really fluffy. But in that context that we've just described, it's like, well, culture is the way in which you deliver on your strategy. Like that's another way of saying it. And that's maybe a simpler way of saying it. And so that's where the company operating system comes in, because it's like, okay, you've got your purpose, your vision, and your strategy. That's your intent that you're putting out into the world, that you're aiming towards. Everything that sits beneath that, so leadership, rituals, the way in which you collaborate and work, that's the way in which you're going to execute on your strategy. And the two things have to link. If they're not linked, then sure, it's just fluffy words and socials and camaraderie. And I think that's what we're trying to do in our work, is create the structure that enables teams to deliver on their strategy, but also be really innovative and creative, and where values come into that. So I think that every other month we all see like an article go out that's like, values are rubbish. And it's like, yeah, they are, if they're just words on a page. And I think that not enough companies are doing the work to take values from words or like cute little statements into actually, okay, what is this? What does this value mean? So if you've got a fun value, as we do, what does that mean in practice? Like, what does good look like? So for us, fun is a lot about creativity, building on people's ideas, looking for the unusual path to doing something that might bring a delighter moment. And then it's like, what's the opposite of that? If that's what good looks like, what would undermine that value? So for us, it would be shutting down someone's idea because it sounds silly, or that's never going to work. That's going to take away from the fun and the playfulness within our ways of working. And I think even further than that, so like behaviors is like the first level, but you can also look at all of the moments within your organization, whether it's hiring, onboarding, career progression, promotions, and you can be like, okay, how can these values influence these moments? And obviously values should be aligned to your strategy as well. Like, so it all kind of comes back together. And we really like the language of company operating system, because we tend to work with a lot of tech companies and agencies, and that concept of, if you imagine your computer, like the great experience that you get on the screen or on your phone, there's lots of important functions that are happening behind the scene that's governed by your operating system that makes that great experience real. And so that's kind of the company operating system is enabling your amazing customer experience at the end.
I also love it because if you think about all of the iOS launches, there's always a point, like 15.1, 15.2. Sometimes they come out like quite quickly, like, we had some bugs in that first version. And I really like you guys often talk as well, like good day, bad day behaviors. And I think it's quite helpful to have, to your point, values that you can actually be like, hey, Alicia, can we grab a moment? Actually, that felt like a bad day version of our value. Let's talk it through and actually check in. Maybe you're having a bad day.
Yes.
There's this kind of growth mindset to it all that isn't, you're either with our values or you're against it. And I think sometimes companies put the cult in culture by kind of being like, you're one thing or you're not, you're a fit or you're not. Can we talk about that idea of culture fit in startups and where it goes right and where it goes wrong?
So we like to talk about values fit and culture add rather than culture fit, because I think culture fit leads us down a route of homogenous teams that look and sound and act the same, and that's not what we're talking about. And values fit to us means that you have some core values which determine how you interact with each other, but also with customers in order to be successful. There's lots of different types of people that will believe in those values, and there's lots of people that won't. So it gives you a bit of a compass to say, look, this is something really core to us. This is something that's really important. So it's a qualifier. Like, if you believe in these things too, then we're probably going to work quite well together. So for example, fun, I've already mentioned that. That's one of ours that we're really keen on. Some people don't want to come to work and be silly.
Yeah.
And that's okay. That means that we're probably not the right place for them. But that's quite an important qualifier for us. So I think you want that kind of alignment from a values perspective, but you also want to look for people that are going to add something new to your team as well. So it's like, okay, we agree on some core principles, but you're going to add a different dimension, a different like perspective or experience to this group. And that doesn't mean we went to the same university or like we grew up in the same place. It's the opposite of that. It's like, how can we ensure that we are considering like whose voices need to be at the table? That's what we mean by culture add, especially when you think about your customer groups. You want to make sure that you've got good representation within your team, because otherwise, you've got your blinkers on in a way.
Not keeping like customer centered or that voice alive as well.
Yeah.
And I think that culture add piece is really important, because you talked about the iOS and the updated versions.
I love that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, and it's the same with your company operating system, right? You will continually have to update it. And that's where the culture add comes in, because the culture you will need and the people you will need at different phases of growth of your business will need to be updated, will need to be renewed, and it's constantly evolving. And I think you have to think about the version you need at each stage. Yeah.
So when do you launch your first operating system as a startup, and how do you, or should you, better question, should it be about the founder at the beginning? Because I think often we have very founder-led cultures, and maybe that's not actually quite what a culture is, but maybe very founder-led, almost like environments vibes, for want of a better word, right? To your point, you model the behavior you want, but often it becomes about the founder's sense of humor or the founder's version of fun. How do you manage that piece?
I think that there's definitely a time when you're probably too small to go down the route of operating system. I think it's never too early to define your purpose, your vision, your values. In fact, you should have that from day one, because that's setting your brand and the perspective that you want to have as a company. We often say that when you're breaching 12 people, you can't all fit around that classic example. You can't all fit around a table anymore. That's the moment that you probably want to start thinking about creating some structure and some operating principles or systems to be able to guide you, especially if you're at that tipping point where you know that you're going to double in size in 6 months, because that rapid growth can outpace your culture. And
Yeah.
there's so many scenarios. I'm sure many of your listeners have seen it, where you've grown rapidly and you look back and you're like, where's that culture gone when it was like 10 of us?
Yeah.
Or like, oh, I really wish I could bring the old culture back. The culture that a company has at 10 people is going to be very different to a company of 50, but it's about keeping the great essence and evolving that as you grow. So I would say that you want to start getting serious about how you operate and kind of structuring that from about 10 upwards, really.
Yeah.
Especially if you're on a big growth trajectory.
Yeah.
Get the words out.
No, it's a tough one. And I think you mentioned about the founder-led culture, it has to be a combination of top down, bottom up. So whenever we work with teams, it's not just about speaking to the founders and the leadership team.
Yeah.
It's about actually getting a sense of what does the culture look like right now and what does that need to look like moving forward. And that's where the strategy piece comes in, because if you've got this really ambitious vision and like you've got some really big, ambitious strategic goals, which I think every startup does or should have, then what do you need in place and what feels feasible to the team as well? And what does that look like? So it has to be that combined effort to set that. Of course, there are going to be louder voices within that when it comes to a founder-led business, but it's just striking that balance as well.
So to that first point of, if you have, you're really at the beginning, it's not too early to set purpose and values. What are some practical things that founders should do? Let's say I'm like starting a company. In fact, starting a side hustle with some friends at the moment, so we can apply this. We're starting a jewelry brand for fun because, don't have enough companies. You guys can be our first buyers.
Yeah.
But let's say me and two friends, Chrissy and Rosie, are starting this company. How do we set our culture and values? What are some things that we should be aware of? And like, again, with the values piece you mentioned, it should be something that is a qualifier. And I think all too often it's like, we want our value to be kindness. And it's like, cool, but who's going to disagree with you?
Yeah.
So what are some really practical things founders should be thinking about, things they should be doing or not doing in that really early, like we have an idea, we don't even have a supplier yet. Like, how can we go about it?
I think it's like, well, because we started the business based on, I think to bring to life, we started it and the idea came from our shared purpose and values. So there was not a business idea. It was actually from that. And I think the same approach still stands. It's really, as a group, as the three of you, digging into why do we exist as a company? So it's really understanding what's the world needs we're responding to, what are our moral beliefs, what are the core strengths, and how does that respond to it? Now, with a jewelry brand, for example, you might be like, am I responding to a world need? Like, what does that look like?
Well, the world needs more pasta-shaped jewelry is our...
Oh, it's pasta-shaped
It's pasta-shaped, but yeah.
Oh my goodness.
But then the world need there, I would be saying, okay, we need more fun. We need more play. We need more joy in the world.
Exactly.
I think there's something about friendship too, like the fact that you're three friends wanting to do this. And I think something that's important to say is that you don't have to go down this route of having some big audacious cause that you're trying to overcome. Like, it can be, wholesome and pure and cute like that. We need those things in the world as well. So I think aligning on the why to start off with is really important. And I also think that we use Ikigai, the Japanese concept that stands for a reason for being, we find that as a model, a really good way to pull out your values and your purpose. But you can just simply sit down together and say, let's imagine our brand as a person. Yeah. What would they say? How would they act? What would they do? What would they feel? And start to embody what that would look like, to identify what the patterns are. And you start to see some themes that are like, okay, this is what's really important to us. And this is how we want customers to feel when they're engaging with us. And I think aligning on that early on, and you don't have to have it fully formed. You don't have to have these beautiful statements that are really smart and funny or like acronyms. You don't need that, but you do need some alignment on what it is you stand for and what you believe in, so that you know that you're all on the same page. And people that come to work with you, you can talk about that and they can be like, oh yeah, I attach to that as well.
I think it actually strikes me as well that the other thing that probably influences or should influence, but maybe doesn't influence enough, this is me getting on my soapbox, is funding strategy. Because actually, to your point, like for us, a value would 100% be fun, right? We were not sober when we started the idea. We've got a WhatsApp full of puns on pasta. Like, it's playful, it's fun, it's silly. Yeah, we'll add you. It's great. It's very enjoyable. But I think actually, like, that would inform, like, we don't want to take funding for this probably. And if we do, we want it to be someone who is in for the jokes.
Yeah.
They're not like, where are your growth numbers? Where are your targets? Because that's not why we're building this business. There are other businesses that you might build that, to your point, like, do have a world-changing mission. And that's going to drive you to think, how do we have the biggest impact possible?
Yeah.
We've got to take funding. So talking about values, I really want to dig into that point about we have these bad day behaviors. How can we be using them as founders to make decisions about what we do and don't do? Because I think you have both talked to me a lot about this before. And again, if we're going to have something that's a qualifier or disqualifier, what else should it be, qualifying, disqualifying? Because one of the things that strikes me is funding strategy. And actually, we don't talk about enough this idea that those values need to match. If I'm building a super fun startup, I might not take funding because actually having investors, they're going to have different objectives. So Alicia, what else would you say values do and don't touch? Maybe diving a little bit deeper on that kind of investor example, what would be some questions you'd be asking investors to check that alignment on funding? And then Nat, maybe we can pick up what else you say yes and no to.
So I think it's really important that with your values, those behaviours are really clearly articulated of what are your supporting behaviours. So we call them your good day behaviours, and what are your undermining behaviours. So we call them your bad day behaviours, but they're the things that don't represent who you are and how you show up. And it's so important that's captured exactly for these kind of conversations of who are you as a company, so that your whole team can align around that. But it's internal as well as external. So it's thinking about, how do we show up every day and how do we hold each other accountable? And it's a really good way of saying, right, this is what we know we stand for and what we agree with and how we show up each day. And this is what we don't. So we can use it for hiring new people and finding those people who are a values fit. We can also do it when we're sort of setting the tone for what our brand is and how that shows up. Because like you say, if you want to be a fun startup, then that needs to be coming to life in your values, and that also needs to come into conversations when you're finding investors. So you need to be able to say, does this align with the investors that we're going to potentially build relationships with? Will they show up in the same way? Or are they going to demonstrate some undermining behaviors that will make that relationship really tough? And it also translates into the experience you deliver for your customers, because those values, how they show up internally, will show up externally. And they're the things that this is all about: your brand, what you stand for, how you behave. And they can be that decision point between what you do and what you don't do, because you've got them fully articulated, documented, and you live and breathe them essentially. And you can lean into those tricky conversations where Nat can pull me up if I've gone into a meeting, haven't showed the most compassion or thought empathetically about how that person's showing.
Which never
She
happens.
can turn-
That's me. Let's be clear.
It'd be mean if I was like, so I can pull Nat up.
Yeah.
But I think
That
it
wouldn't
is
be very
like,
compassionate.
it would be
you
very
know,
compassionate. Thank you. But I think it is that it's being able to have those conversations, because you have to have tough conversations. And if you're moving at speed, you need to be able to have them in the moment. So it's a really strong mechanism for that decision making, and also for having those conversations that can feel tough, but you've got that mechanism in your behaviours to be able to say, this is how we show up, this is how we don't show up.
And again, it gets a bit de-escalated when it's like, it's a good day, it's a bad day. We do all have them, right?
Yeah,
That kind of implies
100%.
that it's okay if you mess up. It's not a deal breaker.
Yeah.
We're here to support you and coach you through it. And I want to come back to that point of like, what else would you say yes and no to, and like what you stand for? But I think it's just really important to pause and say, we're, as founders, under intense stress. And that does mean, it's not an excuse, but it does mean you're going to have bad day behaviors. And coming back to actually something you were saying earlier in the podcast about how with new team members, it's really easy to be like, you're asking loads of questions, I don't have time for this. And I think the founder narrative that I have yet to meet a founder who doesn't have this is like, I would just be quicker to do it myself. Because when you start outsourcing, you have been doing everything yourself. So you actually know how long it takes you. And normally it's maybe not the best job, but you know, 80-20, I can get this out quite quickly. It'll take less energy. I'm just going to do it myself. And I think we default really easily as founders in stress when we're hiring new people to those almost like bad day behaviors. So I think it's important to really articulate, to your point, how might they appear?
Yeah.
What are the narratives you'll have as a founder? How will it show up in your head and in your actions? Because then I think you can interrupt it. So coming back to something that I think is also tricky for founders, at the beginning, there's a ton of opportunities. The business is moving in a million directions at once. There's so much FOMO, or almost fear of leading out rather than just missing out. Like, I'm worried I'm going to lead us in the wrong direction. I'm worried I'm going to take us out of the market. So how do you use your values to help you know what to say yes and no to?
We have to say no as founders. Like, that's the first thing to say, right? And you have to really hone that muscle of saying no, which I feel like is probably the complete opposite of a lot of like the narrative out there. It's like, say yes to every opportunity, take every opportunity. That's not true, because not every opportunity is going to create an impact for your business. Not every opportunity is going to add value. But if you say yes to every opportunity, you're guaranteed that your energy will be depleted.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just, so I think that your values need to be a compass. So does this support our values? Or broader than that, look at your purpose or your vision. Does this help us get closer to that or no? And I think sometimes when we talk about values and company operating systems and stuff like that, it can feel like a lot to do. We often get founders say, this is another thing to add to my to-do list. So if that feels too much right now, simply having, you know, a Google sheet somewhere that says, this is what we stand for, this is what we stand against, which is something that we did really, really early on. You can refer back to that when you're assessing clients or suppliers or investors and say, how do they stack up against these things that we know are really important to us? So I think it's about building your compass for what is in alignment and what's out of alignment and what's a distraction versus actually it's going to add value. And I think not enough is said about saying no as a founder, especially when it comes to investment, which, you know, we can't talk as confidently about because we've decided not to go for investment for the foreseeable. That's our position. And it is because of the type of business that we want to build. We don't see a way to do that keeps in alignment to the type of culture and the type of business that we're trying to create, which isn't, you know, blitz scale. It's more of a slow growth, but still very ambitious company. So yeah, I think it's tools to help you tap into that intuition about the type of company that you are. And I think it's about grounding yourself in that, because as you've said, there are so many opportunities and so much FOMO, and we've fallen foul of it as well, haven't we? Earlier this year, we were like, we need to do a course. We were like, course. And it was basically everyone in our industry was doing a course, which actually turned out to be the reason not to do it. But we realized, we were at your house, weren't we? I think I had slumped so far down the sofa when you said, let's talk about the course.
You were horizontal.
That's my clue. Like,
I love that.
She was like, do you actually want to do this? Or we both kind of looked at each other and we were like, no, we don't. We realized that what we wanted to do is focus on the work that we're doing right now and doing it better and better and better, which is exactly what we have been doing. And, you know, bringing 2 people on and getting them to focus on that as well. Like, it's just like, I feel much more fulfilled out of that than I would have if we were still pushing the course thing. Not to say that we'll never do a course. Like, you'll probably hear us launch one. We'll just
January.
Yeah, exactly. We've changed our mind, people.
Link in the show notes.
And I think if any founders just be like sat there thinking, but how will I know if I'm saying yes or no to the right thing? You will know. I've met a few founders recently who are like, we took on a new client or a new partnership. Our team and our energy doesn't feel right. Something has been out of joint. People are exhausted. We're experiencing burnout. They've really struggled with some of the relationships. And I think that is key. That's when you know something's pushing against your values, because we've all been there. We've done something that doesn't align with our values, and you feel it so much. And don't be hard on yourself either, because you're learning from it and you won't do it again. And that makes your values more concrete as well, because you've gone, what was it there that was causing those issues in the team?
100. And trust, and this is, I don't often say trust your gut because I think it's overrated, but I think the sinking feeling you have when you hit this ethical conundrum is often that, you know, we had it with a podcast sponsor who offered us quite a nice sponsorship rate. Well, I pitched a nice sponsorship rate and they agreed. And I'd kind of been running in sales mode. And then I was like, I'm just going to check this out. It's targeting startups. And actually the feedback on their product was so bad. I was like, I don't actually want to recommend this to founders. And that's a really important thing that we stand for, saving founders time. Like our whole mission is to stop you making common mistakes and let you focus on building your business. Yeah. So if I direct you to the wrong tool, I'm literally doing harm. But it was really hard because I thought, well, with that money, I could reach more founders and I can save them the lessons elsewhere. And it's really easy to justify. But I think when you're having to justify to yourself, that's often a good check-in point of like, something doesn't feel right here.
Also, if you're having to justify it, full stop. And I know, I'm not saying that that's the only, but you had a really big clue that it wasn't right. And I think we have to hold ourselves accountable to saying, am I just coming up with excuses here to make this figure feel good? It's like when people show you their true colours, believe them. And I think that there is something about, like, there's a version, I don't know what it is yet, for business, because you know, that first clue is probably going to be right. And
just when buyers show you their true colours, trust them.
Exactly. That's it. Because they will.
So I want to come back to what happens when you get this right with customers, and that you have a beautiful little story on this. So tell us, what is a great example of a company that nailed their culture and values so much that it translates to customer behavior?
So for this story, we're back in the 1980s. We're traveling to Austin in Texas. And in Austin, there is a creek called Shoal Creek. And I think it was 1981. I'm going to put that out there.
Might be right.
Oh,
yeah.
On the spot, nailed it.
There we go.
Story done.
Yeah, I remembered the date. So back in 1981, the creek burst its banks, and all of the surrounding towns and shops, it was like a kind of town, village, community, loads of it got destroyed, like hundreds, millions of pounds of damage. And one store in particular, it was a natural food store. It opened just a year before. It was completely flooded, completely destroyed, really. And the founders, as you do when you're starting an early stage business, you don't necessarily tick all of the boxes that you're meant to tick. So they didn't have flood insurance. So they were like, okay, cool. We've done a year. It was good while it lasted. We're going to have to shut up shop. We've got no money to repair all of this. But in the kind of following days and weeks, employees and customers started like turning up with like buckets and shovels and mops, I guess. Maybe not shovels. I wasn't
Shovel
there.
This water.
I wasn't there personally. Yes. So they were showing up with tools that would help in such a situation. And they just started helping with the cleanup operation. And when the founder went to one of the customers and was like, why are you doing this? One customer in particular said, I wouldn't want to live in this town if this shop wasn't here. It's made a real difference to my life. And essentially they kept showing up and helping. The employees were coming without pay. There was no way to pay them. The business wasn't getting any money in, but they just kept showing up. And eventually the founders were able to get a loan to kind of repair the business. And I mean, it was a great thing that they did, because they've gone on, I don't know, however many years later, and they're one of the biggest natural food stores across North America and the UK. So any guesses?
I mean, it sounds like a whole big thing.
Exactly.
Nice
like what you did there.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's Whole Foods.
Love it.
And when you could kind of read quotes from the founder, I think is it John Mackey? He attributes the purpose and the ethos of the company being the reason why, you know, they've been able to be successful. And I think a really nice way to look at this is that, you know, people will buy from you because maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's more convenient, but your customers and your employees are only going to go the extra mile when they believe in like the higher purpose or what it is that you stand for as a company. And I think that's a really important example to say, look, it's not just your employees or your investors that are listening, it's your customers that are listening as well. And we've spoken before, I think, about other examples. If you want user-generated content, give your customers something to believe in. And you've told me a really good example before, and I'll tell one, and then you might remember the one. I'll try and remember the one that you've shared with me.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah,
But like,
sure.
so there was a tweet that went viral where a guy had bought a new pair of Allbird trainers, and he like bought them home. They're $120 or whatever in the US, and his puppy had ripped them to shreds. Like, he's literally just got them home. So he sent an email to their like customer service, and they gave him a refund and said, buy yourself a new pair of shoes, like straight away. Or
Did they send a note as well saying, don't be mean to the puppy, it's not their fault, or something?
Yeah, something like
Lovely
that.
touch.
It's very cute.
And then there was another brand called, I think it's Chewy. It's like a pet food brand, and one of their customers, like their dog had sadly, like unexpectedly passed away. So they had like a massive new bags of food. So she emailed them to see if there was something that they could do. And they actually sent her a card, flowers out, gave her the money back for like the whole subscription that had come through, and was like, donate the food to somewhere that needs it. And I think you could look at that and be like, oh, well, they were just good customer service agents. And it's like, no, when you're at a business that has customer service agents, there is the founder can't be there all the time saying, do these things. So it's your values and your ethos and your behaviors that determine these
100%.
actions that make such a big difference. And when you see it on Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever, like, we all love it. We're all like, and you think about that brand differently, even if you've never
100%.
interacted with them before.
Yeah.
Thank God I remember the example. I'm not used to being interviewed on this thing. But luckily it was a really easy trigger from what you just said. So we actually have a whole episode with the founder, a guy called Matt Meeker, founded BarkBox. And again, to your exact point, this is the way he puts it. He learned about customer service because he went around one of his departments one day and saw that there was this like whole box set aside. And he was like, what is this? And essentially one of their customers, turns out this is a dog treat and toy subscription company. One of their customers was a pig, or a pig owner. The pig was buying directly. This is D2P, direct to pig. They loved the box, but they were getting pork treats.
Stop.
And they didn't want to obviously feed their pig pork treats, so they'd written in. And so customer service, without checking with the founder, without checking with anyone, had taken it upon themselves every month to make a separate box for this one customer. And the founder was so thrilled that this behavior had happened without him. He hadn't approved it. And he was like, that's how I was, one of his proudest moments. It's actually how I met him telling that story. So if you want to go back and listen, Matt Meeker, brilliant episode. We have to finish. We're running out of time. I could literally sit and talk to you all day.
Same here.
I mean, it helps that we're friends as well,
Yeah.
but, let's get over that. But I think for anyone listening who is feeling overwhelmed by all of these decisions and how to build a culture in the early stages, obviously check out Future Kind Collective, give Nat and Alicia follows. But it is something to dig into and to start to unpack, because it can do so much good and it can often cause a lot of harm equally easy. So let's leave on a good note. Thank you so much both for coming in.
Thank you. Loved it.
In unison there, weren't we?
Oh, so beautiful. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you for listening. Before you go, please do take a minute to follow so you never miss another episode. We have some incredible founders coming up. And I always love to hear what resonates with listeners. So do drop us a direct message on Instagram @NotMyFirstGuess with any moments that meant something to you, ideas for future episodes, or your own entrepreneurial stories you want to share. Until next time, happy startuping.